so on, been able to keep your eye on current events. But last week, the Russian government apparently, although it's not entirely clear who released it, but somebody released a taping of a phone conversation between the Undersecretary of State for European Affairs, Nuland, of the United States, and the American ambassador to the Ukraine, in which they discussed the crisis and made it fairly evident that the United States is not simply a disinterested partner in, or a party in the outcome of those conflicts, but is actually deeply involved in it, including choosing a successor. In other words, she voiced her opinion about who should be allowed to take the lead in the Ukraine, and in particular stated that, I forget the fellow's name, but the former boxer who's been one of the leading figures in the protest movement in the Ukraine is not appropriate as a member of the new government. And essentially argued that the United States should take the lead in ushering in a new government, and she stated rather bluntly, if we could succeed with that, then screw the European Union, and she used a much more direct word than that, essentially lamenting that the European Union, because of its many members and the difficulty in getting their act together, wasn't able to take any actions in this kind of context, and also anticipated that her preferences for a new government would be torpedoed, if at all possible, by Russia. The Russians obviously released this because the position of the Russian government, as well as the Ukrainian government, is that this protest movement has, from the outset, been an outgrowth of European and American interference in the domestic affairs of the Ukraine. And there certainly is something to that. The United States in particular supports an organization known as the National Endowment for Democracy, that is active in countries around the world in promoting democracy, or the American version of what democracy is. And the involvement of the National Endowment of Democracy and several other groups like it in the Orange Revolution a couple of years ago is very well documented. And it's certainly likely, therefore, that they have not lost interest in the Ukraine since then. This, of course, is somewhat explosive insofar as the Russian government has cut off all aid to the Ukraine, insisting that the Ukraine first creates conditions of stability to allow the aid to be used properly and so on. And is strongly pressuring the Ukrainian government to take some kind of action. And there has even been discussion that the Ukrainian government might ask for help from the Russian government in bringing order to the Ukraine. And that indeed would have rather explosive implications for European politics as a whole, and for the relationship between Western Europe and Russia more specifically. So it's something that's worth keeping our eye on. Let me leave the Ukraine aside for the time being, and pick up where we left off last class, when we talked about trade and the role that trade plays in global politics. Today what I want to do is instead to look at another component of international political economy, finance. And indeed, insofar as that there is a road to an integrated world economy, which I argued that free trade is very much a component of the overall project of creating a single global economy. Then a far larger component of that movement toward a single integrated world economy is the world of finance. And that finance is by far the most internationalized aspect of the global economy. Global financial flows are estimated to amount to somewhere around $5 trillion per year of money that slushes around from various countries to other countries in the international system. And the question is, of course, does this globalization of finance, the free flow of money, serve to develop and stabilize the international economy? Or, as some others have argued, is it a form of exploitation of weak countries in the international system by the more powerful, by the richer? One way of answering that question is, of course, to look at the role that finance has played historically, that is played in the past. And indeed, finance has been an important component of the development of the modern economy. In particular, in the period since the emergence of the modern state system that we talked about last class, in the last 400 or 500 years or so. And the associated development of colonialism, or as some see it, imperialism. In the process of colonialism, finance, of course, played an important role in the colonization of various parts of the world. Colonization involved, on the one hand, the political seizure of territory by countries in Western Europe primarily, in other parts of the world. But that political seizure of control over territory facilitated subsequently investments by entrepreneurs from the home country in those territories. And those investments are essentially what we're talking about in talking about finance. Money being invested for various reasons in countries other than the country of its origin. As such, foreign investment or investment in colonies played a crucial role in establishing a kind of division of labor between the home country and its colonies, in which the home countries, England, France, and so on, became largely exporters of industrial goods, and their colonies became importers of those industrial goods and exporters of raw materials and agricultural goods. But the export of raw materials and agricultural goods in turn required investments to establish them. Meaning that these countries weren't sitting on a pile of coffee or cocoa or sugar or tobacco or what have you, waiting for somebody to come along and export them, or import them rather. Most countries of the now colonized world were previously relatively self-sufficient and to a large extent dependent on subsistence agriculture for meeting their basic needs. And thus, to integrate them as suppliers of raw materials and agricultural goods into a colonial structure dominated by European power involved substantial investments. Investments, first and foremost, in creating kind of infrastructure necessary to get raw materials and agricultural goods from these colonies to the homeland, starting with the building of roads from the interior of these regions to ports. Then building the ports. In many cases, roads were not sufficient and railroads were much more convenient. And consequently, heavy investment in railroads was involved. All of this involved finance. All of that involved investment. And that investment, as all investment does, takes place not out of necessity or out of a sense of obligation, but rather because the holders of these finances are in search of profitable investments for their monies, for their capital. Each investment, therefore, in a developing country or in a colony was made not out of charity, not because the government favored it, but because some private investor recognized that by investing their money in establishing a railroad in a particular place, they could get a substantial and handsome return on that investment over time that would make it worthwhile. Now, these kinds of investments were first carried out overwhelmingly by national empires, like that of the British and the French. But by the second half of the 19th century, both Britain and France and much of the rest of the world shifted away from that, what we describe, mercantilist orientation of colonialism, of establishing national empires, toward a liberalization of trade and a liberalization of investment that went with it. And thus, in the latter half of the 19th century, enormous amounts of investments flowed into less developed regions of the world. By far the largest share of investments in the second half of the 19th century flowed to the United States, which was at the time the largest borrower on the planet, and used that money in order to build its own infrastructure, to establish its own plantation economies in the South, build and develop its industries in the North, and so on and so forth. However, what should be clear in regard to investments of this sort, or financial flows of this sort, is that any financial flow in one direction eventually results in a financial flow in the opposite direction. Meaning nobody invests in anything, whether it's a government, a private individual, or corporation, just out of altruism. They invest by virtue of the fact that they expect a larger return on that investment. And that, in turn, allows us to understand why finance is today, and has always been, rather controversial. The British Empire justified its colonialism and the finance that went with it as part of the white man's burden to bring civilization and a better life to the rest of the world. In other words, it portrayed it as largely positive and as providing or creating progress in backward parts of the world. But from the outset, there were different perspectives on this. And probably one of the most vocal critics of financial flows of this sort was Vladimir Lenin, who denounced them essentially as a form of imperialism, as a form of exploitation of third world countries by the first world. I don't want to bore you with a long history of finance throughout the ages. Suffice it to say that in trying to understand how finance works today, the role that it plays in international relations, it's worth it to keep those basic facts in mind. And those basic facts have not really changed over the centuries, as illustrated by the opening pages of the chapter on finance in your textbook, which looks at the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, and points out that, well, it attaches to that brief history that I just mentioned of the expansion of credit throughout the 19th century, in particular credit to regions like Latin America, South and East Asia, and so on. And the fact that as the economies of the global economy turned sour at the end of the 19th century, the beginning part of the 20th century, in other words, as a recession took hold, the ability of various countries to pay back those various debts that had been incurred started to become more problematic, resulting ultimately in a lot of defaults and consequently in banks refusing to lend, in particular in developing regions of the world, which pretty much stayed the case throughout the period of the 1920s and 30s, up until the 1970s. In the 1970s, as your text observes, banks started to lend in large amounts to countries in the developing world once again. Thus, between 1973 and 1982, Latin America's debt as a region increased from $40 billion to $330 billion. By the time that it reached $330 billion, however, a number of states in Latin America started to have trouble maintaining their debt obligations, meaning being able to pay back the credit, part of the interest on their loans, as well as the portions of the principal that came due. International loans in this regard and international finance is no different than buying a house on a mortgage. You get the money, you get your house, but then you have to pay the interest as well as the principal portions as they come due. And if you start having trouble doing so, that tends to lead to a crisis. It leads to a crisis in that, on the one hand, if you cannot make good on your payment on your debt obligations internationally and you default, countries in the international community and banks and those that loan you money are not going to look upon this kindly. And they're going to do whatever is possible to sanction you in one form or another to prevent you from defaulting. The other reason that it's bad, and that the collapse that occurred in Latin America, beginning with the default on its debt of Mexico in 1982, basically threatened to bring down all of the banks in North America. Banks had so heavily loaned money to Latin America that if all of the Latin American countries defaulted at the same time, they would themselves not have enough cash in reserve to meet their own debt obligations. And that would mean that the banks would collapse. And a banking collapse would have resulted in international financial chaos and probably a renewed Great Depression. And thus, everything was done that was possible in order to prevent such a collapse. And the United States and the lending institutions were pretty creative in how they went about preventing this kind of a collapse. One thing is that the first resort is, of course, that if a country like Mexico finds itself unable to meet its obligations to banks, one way of making sure that they are able to meet their obligations to banks is to lend them more money. And indeed, that's what the US government began to do with Mexico. In essence, simply to allow them to maintain their debt with regard to banks and other private institutions and to prevent an overall default and collapse. They also were very creative to make sure that the debt obligations of the various countries in Latin America never actually came up at the same time for renegotiation. In other words, what they wanted to crucially avoid is that since all of the Latin American states found themselves in more or less the same situation, that they form a kind of debtors cartel in order to increase their bargaining position with respect to the North American states as well as the banks that were holders of those loans. And by doing so, to pursue a kind of a divide and conquer kind of strategy. Ultimately, a complete collapse was avoided. And thus the world was spared a global recession and a global depression, but Latin America was not let off the hook so easily. Essentially, the 1980s and to some extent that into the 1990s were described in Latin America as a lost decade. A lost decade because whatever gains were made in development prior to 1982 disappeared as a result of the austerity measures that were imposed on Latin American states, of the hyperinflation that resulted from their debt problems, which in turn produced falling standards of living, and forced their governments to adopt policies being pushed upon them by the countries of the North, the creditor states, such as privatization, deregulation of their industries, and trade liberalization. Latin America did not start to show positive signs of growth again until well into the 1990s and the last decade. Now the question is, if this has happened before, borrowers certainly have gotten themselves into trouble with creditors since biblical times in various forms or another. Why were banks so keen to lend so much money to countries of Latin America? The answer to that is fairly easy to provide. Essentially, a key component to that is the OPEC oil shocks. The OPEC oil shocks. Now you might recall that during the 1950s and 60s and so on, the overwhelmingly biggest producers of oil became the states of the Middle East. In combination with a few other countries like Nigeria, Venezuela, to a lesser extent Mexico, and to a somewhat lesser extent Indonesia, that provided cheap oil, extremely cheap oil, Throughout the 1960s, a gallon of gasoline in the United States cost less than 25 cents a gallon. In other words, it was cheaper by a long shot than buying a bottle of water or milk or anything else of that sort. And this came to be rather resented by the exporting countries. The exporting countries recognized, of course, they were making plenty of money, but not nearly as much as they perceived themselves being able to make. In large part because the oil industry was controlled by a few big companies owned by North American and European owners that were managing the market in their own interest. And starting in the 1960s, Venezuela, along with a few other countries in the Middle East, including Iran most prominently, began negotiations to organize a cartel of oil producers in order to rectify this situation. And it took them about 13 years from the first meetings to try to establish an oil cartel in the early 1960s to put together OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And in 1973, OPEC, for the first time, cut off the supply of oil to Western markets. The actual spark that created this was the war between Israel and its neighbors in 1973, which pushed many of the Arab oil producers to try to punish the West for its support for the state of Israel by raising the price of oil drastically. Well, it worked. The price of oil more than doubled in 1973. And a second set of oil shocks took place in 1978, which again came close to doubling the price of oil on world markets. And that had some pretty phenomenal impacts. One major impact that it had is that the American car